Well, hello everybody, and welcome one more time to the Past Days with Pastor Joel. Always so good to be with you again. And a lot of you know I work more than one job. It's got a lot of things going on, and it was weird because I am not good like at fixing things. What in the world does this have to do with the price of tea in China? Nothing. But just bear with me here. I'm just not very mechanical. Like I'm not the guy you want to invite over to your house to help you with electrical work or just to fix stuff. I'm going to make it worse. So I was surprised this bicycle shop of all places also asked me if I was looking for another job. And I said, I don't really know how to fix bikes. I could probably pump up a tire or something like that. And they said, no. We were hoping you could be the spokesman. But I'm rolling today. Well, hey, just want to remind you, if you are interested at all in supporting this channel, I'd love to have you do that. I'll put a link for my Patreon account, which is patreon.com/The Past Days with Pastor Joel. The Past Days with Pastor Joel, all one word, all lowercase. I'll put the link in the description. Also, if you are interested in purchasing my book, Seismic Shift, A Pastor's End Times Trek, I will also put a link in the description. 28 reviews on Amazon. All 5-star reviews, every single one of them. Really good positive comments on there. A lot of people have benefited from it, and I tried to write it in a style that not only would be helpful to you, but that would help you to teach others the content. I think it's a really good on-ramp to the fulfilled view, sometimes called preterism, covenant eschatology. Choose your pronouns, the ones you like the best. And I know there are nuances within those, but I'm just saying this is a really, really good on-ramp, and it's just scripture, a lot of scripture. And I would encourage you to purchase that for yourself, maybe even give it to your pastor, another church leader, family member. All right. Well, we are sort of wrapping up this, section of Genesis. This is part of a long series of videos called God's Story. That's sort of the big picture view of God's plan of redemption, wherein there are lots of smaller stories and narratives that are so powerful and profound, and that we really need to understand. And in the next video, we're going to get into the story of Joseph, which I absolutely love. It is such a touching and just marvelous story, and we see God's sovereignty just working through the life of Joseph. But we've just got a few things to wind down before we get there. And so I would encourage you to go back to the previous videos so you get some of the context. But we're going to start with a really sort of a bizarre passage of scripture, actually, from Genesis 32. If you want to follow along, Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32. Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32. So let me pull it up here so you can see it. The same night, he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. Sounds like something out of a Klingon Star Trek movie. Jabbok. Anyway, he took them and sent. I have had coffee earlier, but not for a while. I don't know what's going on. Verse 23, he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And here's where it gets, shall I say, bizarre. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. It's really interesting, the connection there. I have named you this because this. I've named you Israel because you've striven with God and men and have prevailed. We'll get back to that. Verse 29, then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, Peniel, not sure how to pronounce that, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So if you were wondering why don't they eat that, now you know. So again, what a interesting. Let me strange, odd story we have. That's why I titled this video, Jacob Wrestles with God. It appears that he does in some shape or fashion. We know from these videos, but certainly if you're familiar at all with the Genesis narrative, that Jacob's life has been characterized by struggle, much of it by his own making, especially when it came to obtaining, trying to earn for himself the blessing from God. He had struggled with Esau. We see that chapters 25 and 27, particularly Isaac in chapter 27, his father, and his father-in-law Laban, chapters 29 to 31. Just by way of application, have you ever noticed that people who struggle significantly in some relationships often struggle in most of their relationships? What's the common denominator? Well, in my case, me, in their case, them. But finally here, Jacob struggles with this man. At first it appears to be a man, but let's go back and just look at this text again so we get it. It says first in verse 24, Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw, so we think it could have just been some man here. But then as it goes on, your name, this is verse 28, shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And he says, please tell me your name. And then Jacob comes to the conclusion in verse 30, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered. So who is this? What's happening? And I think it's not always that this, when scholars tend to agree, that doesn't mean they're correct. But in the scholarship, we see that this seems to be, some people would call it a Christophany, sometimes referred to as the pre-incarnate Christ. We've seen throughout several other texts here what we might call the visible Yahweh. So in a sense, we've got the invisible Yahweh, who we might think of as the Father, but we've got the visible Yahweh. The New Testament says of the Son of God that he was the exact image of him. And so we seem to have that going on here, that on the one hand, he's wrestling with a man, and this could have very well been someone in the form of a man, a corporeal being. We know that other places in the Old Testament, the angels have shown up, but people have not known that they were angels. It means presumably they were so physical, they were so corporeal, they ate, talked, and all sorts of things. So we have this, on the one hand, man, but also perhaps a Christophany, the pre-incarnate Christ. Interestingly, just earlier, like a couple hours ago, I'm involved in a podcast on Revelation with Zach Davis, Michael Sullivan, and Rick Welch. Travis Drum had been joining us in the beginning, and just due to some conflicts, hasn't been able to stay in. But you might want to check that out. By the way, it's a Revelation basically from a preterist perspective. But just earlier in our episode today, this story came up, and could this have been, we tend to think of more of a spiritual type of being that maybe is corporeal in some way, but could this have even been, when later in the incarnation of Christ, could it have been actually something very, very similar, someone very similar to that? And we don't really know. The story doesn't tell us, but Jacob certainly thought that in some way he had seen God face to face. He makes that comment. So it'd be very, very interesting. Again, we have here verse 32. Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. If nothing else, he's tenacious. And again, was this a man, an angel, the visible Yahweh? We really don't know for sure, but Jacob certainly believed that in some way he had wrestled with God himself. Verse 32:28 is so important in this passage. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. I was wondering, was that the first time that Jacob was referred to Israel? And I did look that up, and it seems in fact to be. So this is incredibly important. And how many of us, let's speak for myself, we eventually met Christ. He saved us. However that happened, you had your born again experience, probably became part of some type of a gathering of believers, began reading the Bible, studying, praying, that the things that we do to grow and mature in our faith. And we had some idea of Israel, but not really making this connection that this is actually a man. We start with Abraham, and we might think of sort of the, I guess, the starting point of what becomes this nation of Israel. Abraham's a pagan from everything we can tell, but then we've got Isaac, his son, and his grandson Jacob, and Jacob is later renamed Israel in this bizarre wrestling encounter with God. And then from there, as we go on in the story, then Israel is going to have 12 sons, become the 12 tribes, and we just don't often piece those things together, but they're so foundational. They're such anchors in our understanding of Scripture. And so that's why that verse again is so important. 38:28, the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel." And then there's a because. This is why it's Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And this is why it's so important. And we'll get to more of this as we go through the story. But let's just trace this briefly. We go back to Adam. Adam is told not to do something, which he disobeys God. He fails, and later we go on in the story, and we've got maybe it's going to be this person. Maybe they're going to get it right. Maybe this person, and it's like nobody can do it. We get to Abraham, who's called a man of faith and does some things wonderfully well, but he also lies on a couple of occasions. He comes up with this idea with his wife, who later is Sarah, but Sarai at the time, that maybe they're going to make this promise happen on their own terms, so he can't quite get it right. And then we get to Jacob, who Jacob himself, fails over and over miserably. And then we get to the nation of Israel, which comes from him being renamed Israel. As we go through the story, the nation of Israel can't get it right. And finally, we get to Jesus, who is the true Israel and is the one who can get it right. And it's just so important to see that thread through Scripture. So I wanted to mention that. I'm going to pull back up my screen here because I want to share with you a couple things from Michael Heiser that I think are helpful in terms of this story. So let's just get it here. Heiser says, this mysterious man says, "You have striven with Elohim." That's how it would be in the original language. Again, God is a category. God is not really a name. So God is an Elohim, but only one Elohim is Yahweh. Okay, that's the idea. And this Elohim that he's wrestling with is tangible and corporeal. I already mentioned that. Now, you might want to write these references down. Hosea 12:3-4 confirms the divine identity of Jacob's opponent, but adds two surprising details. And it says this: in the womb, he, Jacob, deceived his brother, and in his manhood, he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel. And there again, we've got this interesting sort of intermixture. On the one hand, God, but then the angel, who there seems to be a sort of a purposeful blurring of these beings. He struggled with the angel and prevailed. He pleaded for his mercy. He met him at Bethel, and there he spoke with him. Okay? So this is from Heiser, The Unseen Realm, a book I would highly, highly recommend, page 139. He says, not only does Hosea describe Jacob's Elohim opponent as an angel, but the last line of this quotation identifies this angel with Bethel. Curiously, we know from Genesis 32 that this incident did not occur at Bethel. It was at the waters of Jabbok. So Hosea's inspired commentary on the incident isn't about geography. He's telling us that Jacob wrestled with God himself, physically embodied, and he identifies God with the angel who said he was the God of Bethel. Just out of this world, maybe in some sense, in real sense, because Bethel means house of God. Let me just read that again without commenting on it this time so you can get the whole thing. Again, this is from Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm, page 139. Referring to the Genesis text I read earlier. Not only does Hosea describe Jacob's Elohim opponent as an angel, but the last line of this quotation identifies the angel with Bethel. But curiously, we know from Genesis 32 the incident did not occur at Bethel. It was at the waters of Jabbok. Hosea's inspired commentary on the incident isn't about geography. He's telling us that Jacob wrestled with God himself, physically embodied, and identifies God with the angel who said he was the God of Bethel. And again, Bethel means house of God. So just fantastic. There's a whole lot in this wrestling match here to deal with. And so I wanted to talk about some of those things. As we begin to set up the next video a little bit, going into the life of Joseph, if we go ahead a little bit in Genesis, again, we'll see all these recurring themes. God says in chapter 35, be fruitful and increase in number in verses 11 and 12, which goes back to the blessing of creation, Genesis 1:28. Where else do we have that? At least one other place I can think of off the top of my head is after the flood event. Then Noah is told to increase and multiply, sometimes referred to as the dominion mandate or something similar by those who study these things, theologians and scholars and so on. Secondly, there's a mention of royalty that's made in the promised seed. This took place initially in Genesis 17:6, talks about kings and peoples will come from her. And then thirdly, we see the promise of the land was renewed in verse 12. This is all from chapter 35. And here's where this kind of all is heading as we're going to move along in the story. Two lines have been running in parallel, but they're about to converge, and a single theme will emerge. Jacob has two wives, each representing a possible line for the promise to be carried out. The line of Rachel through Joseph, or the line of Leah through Judah. And again, as we go on in the story, this is just fascinating because in God's sovereign plan, we keep, like, if we were watching it in like a movie today, we would think one set of circumstances was going to take place, and God often then turns us on its head so that the blessing comes about in a way we might not expect. And of course, ultimately, this blessing comes through Judah, but also through the line of Joseph, if I can say it that way. So it's just fascinating. And next week, again, we're going to get into the story of Joseph, which is one of my favorite stories. When I say story, I'm not saying story in the sense that I don't think it actually happened, but a favorite true story. I often tear up. I don't know how many times I've read the Bible, and just it is such an incredible story. And we see that Joseph is a type of Christ, big time. We get to this wonderful climax of the story, verse 50:20, where Joseph says, you had meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, and these people are going to be saved and all this. And I did a sermon one time called 50:20. We talked about how 50:20 vision was actually 20:20 vision when we look at this through the eyes of Joseph. So powerful, powerful story we're going to move into. And just reminding you, for those of you that you really love end times, you love eschatology, you love the fulfilled view, covenant eschatology, preterism, whatever you want to call it. I'm not abandoning that whatsoever. Now, certainly there are other things in Scripture that don't deal directly with that, but it is such a powerful thing. What I believe is about far more than eschatology. It's a very hermeneutic. It's a very way of seeing and understanding, I believe, all of the Scriptures and bringing together the continuity of the Scriptures. And my interpretation of the Scriptures is essentially Jesus, the apostles, and the Old Testament prophets. And they're all talking about the same thing largely in terms of how redemption has worked out. So everything I have been doing from the beginning of this God story series, and that I will keep doing, is actually going to lead into a very robust understanding of why I have the fulfilled view of Scripture that I do. And I dare say, not because of the way I'm doing these videos, but because of the clarity of Scripture, that this is an irrefutable understanding of Scripture. I honestly believe that from the top of my head down to the bottom of my toes. So I think you're going to be so blessed, and I was going to say enriched. Enriched is now a term. I've made it thus on this video. I'm so blessed and enriched. And you're going to have so many tools to share these things with other people, because the eschatology of Jesus, the eschatology of the New Testament is not its own eschatology. They say over and over, we're not saying anything different than what the prophets taught. And we're going to start seeing this as we move in this story. And we're really at the beginning of that as we get to Israel. Again, Jacob is renamed Israel in the dream we started with. And as we get to Israel, the 12 tribes, which becomes this nation, which Yahweh chooses and selects as his own special people, has everything to do with where the eschaton, where this eschatology goes, and where we land as we move forward in the story. So don't think of this, and not that any of you are, but we'll get through some of this stuff. There might be a couple of helpful nuggets, but then we'll get to the good stuff later. That this is the good stuff because it leads into the good stuff later. All right, and so that's all I have for this video. Pastor Joel saying bye for now.